Hello everyone and welcome back to continue our journey through the history of English literature. In the previous lecture, we explored the historical foundations of Anglo-Saxon England and examined how successive migrations, political transformations and religious changes contributed to the emergence of an English nation. We observed how the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes reshaped the cultural landscape of Britain and how the gradual spread of Christianity altered the social and intellectual life of the people. Today, we move from the history of literature and begin our examination of the earliest surviving body of English poetry. The literature of the Anglo-Saxon period occupies a unique position in the literary history because it stands at the intersection of two different worlds. On the one hand, it preserves the values, beliefs, and imaginative traditions of a heroic Germanic society. On the other hand, it reflects the influence of Christianity, which gradually transformed the intellectual and spiritual outlook of England. As a result, Old English literature is neither entirely pagan nor entirely Christian. Rather, it represents a fascinating synthesis of these two traditions. Heroic ideals inherited from Germanic ancestors coexist with Christian teachings introduced through the Church. Understanding this interaction is essential because it explains many of the apparent contradictions that we encounter in Anglo-Saxon poetry. Before examining individual poems, it is important to understand the conditions under which this literature was produced. Unlike modern literature, which is usually written for silent reading, Anglo-Saxon poetry emerged within an oral culture. In such a society, poetry was not primarily a written artifact, it was a performance. The poet composed his verses to be heard rather than read. The audience encountered literature collectively in public spaces rather than individually in private settings. Consequently, the structure, language, and style of Old English poetry was shaped by the requirements of oral performance. The central figure in this literary culture was the scop, the Anglo-Saxon poet. The scop occupied a highly respected position within society. He was far more than an entertainer. He functioned as a custodian of memory, a chronicler of heroic achievements, and an interpreter of cultural values. In a society where written records were rare, the poet preserved the stories of kings, warriors, battles, and migrations. Through poetry, communities remembered their past and transmitted their values to future generations. To appreciate the significance of the scop, we must recall the social environment of Anglo-Saxon England. The mead hall formed the center of communal life. It was the place where the king received his retainers, where victories were celebrated, where political alliances were forged, and where social bonds were strengthened. During feasts and gatherings, the poet would recite songs accompanied by a lyre. These performances served several purposes simultaneously. They entertained the audience, preserved historical memory, reinforced loyalty to the Lord, and celebrated the heroic ideals upon which society was founded. This connection between poetry and social identity explains why literature held such importance in Anglo-Saxon culture. Poetry was not regarded as a separate artistic activity detached from everyday life. Instead, it was deeply integrated into the social and political structure of the community. The stories recited by poets helped define what it meant to be courageous, loyal, generous, and honorable. Literature therefore functioned as a vehicle for cultural education. The oral nature of Anglo-Saxon poetry also explains many of its formal characteristics. The most distinctive feature of Old English verse is its reliance on alliteration. Modern readers often associate poetry with rhyme, but rhyme played only a minor role in Anglo-Saxon literature. Instead, poets created rhythm and musicality through the repetition of consonant sounds. These recurring sounds linked different parts of the line and provided a structural framework that aided both memorization and performance. Another important feature is the use of caesura. Each poetic line is divided into two halves, separated by a pause. This pause not only creates rhythm but also allows the performer to emphasize particular ideas and images. The result is a verse form that possesses both flexibility and strength. The rhythm emerges from patterns of stress rather than fixed syllable counts, producing a style that sounds markedly different from later English poetry. The linguistic structure of Old English also contributed to the distinctive character of its poetry. Old English was an inflected language. Grammatical relationships were indicated through word endings rather than strict word order. As a result, poets enjoyed considerable freedom in arranging words within a line. This flexibility enabled them to place important sounds in strategic positions and create complex patterns of alliteration. Equally significant is the use of variation, a stylistic device that frequently appears in Old English poetry. Variations involve expressing the same idea through multiple descriptive phrases. Instead of referring to a king repeatedly by the same term, a poet might call him ruler, lord, ring giver, protector, or a treasure distributor. This technique enriches the narrative and provides additional information while maintaining poetic rhythm. What might appear repetitive to modern readers was regarded as a mark of artistic sophistication by Anglo-Saxon audiences. Perhaps the most famous feature of Old English poetic style is the use of kenning. A kenning is a compound expression that replaces an ordinary noun with a metaphorical description. The sea becomes the whale road. The body becomes the bone house. A ship becomes a sea steed. A king becomes a ring giver. These expressions are far more than decorative ornaments. They reveal how Anglo-Saxons perceived the world around them. Through kennings, everyday objects are transformed into vivid imaginative images. At the same time, they provide valuable insights into the values and experiences of the society that produced them. The importance of kennings becomes particularly evident when we consider the heroic culture of Anglo-Saxon England. A ruler is called a ring giver because generosity was considered one of the most important royal virtues. The king maintained the loyalty of his followers by distributing treasure and rewards. Likewise, the sea is described as a whale road because it is understood primarily as a route to travel and adventure. The language itself therefore reflects the social realities of the age. These formal characteristics remind us that Old English poetry was designed to be heard. The poems were performances rather than texts. Their rhythms, repetitions, and sound patterns were intended to captivate listeners gathered in communal spaces. Even after poems were eventually written down, they retained many traces of their oral origins. This raises an important question. If Anglo-Saxon poetry was primarily oral, how has it survived to the present day? Answer in the comments below. The answer lies in the work of Christian scribes. As Christianity spread throughout England, monasteries became centers of learning and manuscript production. Clerics began recording poems that had previously circulated orally. In doing so, they preserved a vast body of literature that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Most Old English poetry survives in only 4 major manuscripts. These manuscripts constitute the foundation of our knowledge of Anglo-Saxon literature. The Junius manuscript contains biblical poems and works associated with Caedmonian tradition. The Vercelli book preserves several important religious poems. The Cotton Vitellius manuscript contains Beowulf and Judith. Finally, the Exeter book preserves an extraordinary collection of elegies, riddles, wisdom, poems, and heroic narratives. Among these manuscripts, the Exeter book occupies a particularly important position. Copied around the 10th century and later donated to Exeter Cathedral by Bishop Leofric, it preserves many of the finest examples of Old English poetry. Without this manuscript, poems such as The Wanderer, The Seafarer, The Wife's Lament, Deor, and Widsith would have been lost forever. The Exeter book, therefore, represents one of the most valuable literary treasures of early English culture. The preservation of these poems by Christian scribes, however, also created certain complications. Many of the poems originated within a pagan heroic culture, yet they were recorded by Christian clerics. As a result, Christian ideas sometimes appear within texts whose fundamental values remain deeply rooted in the heroic past. Scholars frequently debate the extent to which Christian elements were added by later scribes or were already present in the poems themselves. This tension between pagan and Christian perspectives is one of the defining characteristics of Anglo-Saxon literature. Having explored the general features of Old English poetry, we may now turn to one of the earliest and most fascinating examples of tradition, Widsith. Widsith survives in the extra book and is generally regarded as one of the oldest surviving Anglo-Saxon poems. The title means far traveller or widely travelled alone, and the poem presents itself as the autobiographical account of a wandering poet who journeys across the Germanic world through the voice of this traveller. The poem offers a remarkable glimpse into the cultural imagination of the heroic age. At first glance, Widsith appears to be a travel narrative. The speaker describes visits to numerous courts and encounters with famous rulers and peoples. He mentions Goths, Huns, Franks, Danes, Swedes, Anglo-Saxons, Burgundians, and many other tribes. The geographical scope of the poem is astonishing. The narrator seems to traverse virtually the entire Germanic world. However, a closer examination reveals that the poem cannot be understood as a literal autobiography. Many of the kings and heroes mentioned belong to different historical periods. Some lived centuries apart. No single individual could possibly have met all the figures whom Widsith claims to have encountered. This observation has led scholars to interpret the poem symbolically rather than literally. The figure of Widsith represents the ideal scop. He is less an individual person than an embodiment of poetic memory itself. Through his travels, he gathers stories from different peoples and preserves them in song. He becomes a bridge connecting diverse communities across time and space. In this sense, the poem celebrates the role of the poet as a custodian of collective memory. One of the most striking aspects of Widsith is its cosmopolitan outlook. The poem praises heroes and rulers from many different ethnic groups. Courage, generosity, and honor are admired regardless of tribal affiliation. This perspective reflects the realities of the post-migration world, where different people interacted, competed, and exchanged cultural traditions. Heroic excellence transcends ethnic boundaries. Another important theme concerns the relationship between poets and patrons. Throughout the poem, Widsith repeatedly refers to the gifts he receives from kings. He mentions treasures, ornaments, and even grants of land. These references remind us that poetry was deeply connected to systems of patronage. The poet depended upon the generosity of the rulers for his livelihood, while rulers depended upon poets to preserve and publicize their reputations. The exchange of gifts therefore had both economic and symbolic significance. The concluding section of Widsith provides a particularly valuable insight into Anglo-Saxon values. The poem emphasizes that worldly success is temporary, kingdom rise and fall, wealth disappears, human life is fleeting, yet fame can survive through poetry. A ruler who demonstrates generosity and heroism achieves lasting reputation because the poet preserves his memory. Literature thus became a means of overcoming mortality. This idea of enduring fame occupies a central place within heroic culture. The awareness of life's transience creates a desire for remembrance. Poetry offers one form of immortality. Through song, the deeds of the past continue to live in the minds of future generations. As we conclude our discussion of Widsith, we can already observe several themes that will reappear throughout Anglo-Saxon literature: the importance of memory, the fragility of human achievements, the value of reputation, and the central role of the poet in preserving cultural identity. These themes become even more prominent in the elegiac poetry that we shall examine next. In the next part of this lecture, we will turn our attention to Deor, the great Anglo-Saxon elegies, including the Seafarer and the Wanderer. Through these poems, we will encounter a different dimension of Old English literature. Alongside heroic celebration, we discover profound reflections on exile, suffering, loss, transience, and the search for meaning in an uncertain world. If Widsith celebrates movement, fame, and preservation of heroic memory, the poems we are about to discuss explore loss, suffering, exile, and the fragility of human existence. Together, they form what modern scholars call the Anglo-Saxon elegiac tradition. The term elegy can sometimes be misleading because these poems are not elegies in the modern sense of poems written exclusively to mourn the dead. Rather, the term is used to describe poems characterized by a mood of reflection, melancholy, and meditation on loss. The Anglo-Saxon elegies are concerned with the instability of human life, the disappearance of worldly glory, the pain of separation, and the search for wisdom in a transient world. They represent some of the most psychologically complex works in early English literature. At first glance, it may seem surprising that a society renowned for its martial values produced such introspective poetry. The same culture that celebrated warriors, battles, and heroic achievements also created poems filled with loneliness, uncertainty, and sorrow. Yet, this apparent contradiction becomes understandable whether we consider the historical realities of Anglo-Saxon life. Heroic society was built upon unstable foundations. Political fortunes changed rapidly. Kingdoms rose and fell, lords died in battles, retainers lost their protectors, entire communities could disappear within a generation. The awareness of impermanence was therefore not an abstract philosophical concern, but it was a lived reality that people faced every day. The heroic ideal promised glory, but it could not eliminate suffering. Indeed, the very conditions that produced heroic achievements also generated exile, displacement, and grief. As a result, Anglo-Saxon literature developed a profound awareness of transience. Human life was understood as a precarious and uncertain way. Even the greatest achievements were valuable to destruction by time. That is, they were vulnerable to destruction by time. This concern with transience acquired additional significance after the spread of Christianity. While pagan heroic culture sought permanence through fame and reputation, Christianity offered a different solution. Instead of pursuing earthly glory, Christians were encouraged to focus on eternal salvation. Earthly life came to be viewed as temporary, while true permanence belonged to the spiritual realm. Interestingly, these two perspectives often coexist within Anglo-Saxon literature. The poems preserve the emotional intensity of heroic culture while simultaneously reflecting Christian ideals about mortality and eternity. One of the earliest and most important poems that illustrates this transition is Deor. Unlike Widsith, which celebrates the poet's journeys and successes, Deor is a poem about adversity. Yet it is not a poem of despair. Rather, it explores the possibility of endurance in the face of suffering. The poem introduces us to a speaker who has experienced personal misfortune. However, instead of immediately revealing the nature of his own difficulties, Deor begins by recounting a series of legendary examples. He reminds his audience of his famous figures from Germanic traditions who endured suffering, humiliation, and loss. Through these stories, he gradually develops a larger meditation on the nature of adversity itself. The first examples concern Wieland the Smith, one of the most celebrated figures in Germanic legend. Wieland was captured by King Nithud, crippled and forced into servitude. His suffering is presented as extreme and unjust. Yet the story does not end there. Wieland ultimately escapes and overcomes his circumstances. The poem then turns to Bedohild, who suffers humiliation and grief followed by Nithud himself, whose cruelty ultimately brings misery upon him. In each case, suffering appears unavoidable but is never permanent. The poem then moves to broader historical and legendary examples. It refers to the Theodoric and Ormaneric figures associated with Germanic heroic traditions. Once again, the emphasis falls not upon triumph but upon endurance. Great men experience hardship just as ordinary people do. Power does not protect individuals from sufferings. What gives the poem its remarkable emotional force is the refrain that follows each example. That passed away, so may this. These words are repeated throughout the poem, creating a rhythm of consolation. Each story becomes evidence that suffering is temporary. No matter how severe adversity may appear, it eventually passes. Only in the final section does the speaker reveal his own situation. He has lost his position as a court poet, another singer has replaced him in the favor of his lord. The personal disappointment that motivates the poem is therefore relatively modest compared to the legendary sufferings described earlier. Yet this contrast is deliberate. Deor suggests that all forms of suffering, whether great or small, belong to the same human experience. Sorry for my voice. The lesson of the poem lies not in the specific nature of the hardship, but in the recognition that adversity is universal and temporary. This theme of endurance links Deor to the broader tradition of Anglo-Saxon elegiac poetry. These elegies are not merely expressions of sorrow, they are attempts to discover wisdom through suffering. Their speakers confront loss, but they also seek understanding. Among the poems, the Seafarer occupies a particularly important position. It is one of the most frequently discussed and debated works in Old English literature because it combines personal experience, philosophical reflections, and religious meditations in a highly complex manner. The poem is spoken by a figure who has spent much of his life at sea. He describes the hardships of maritime existence in vivid detail. The cold, the loneliness, the storms, and the constant uncertainty of life upon ocean are presented with remarkable immediacy. Unlike those who live comfortably on land, the seafarer is exposed to full force of nature. He endures physical suffering, emotional isolation, and perpetual danger. What makes the poem particularly fascinating is that the speaker does not simply complain about these hardships. On the contrary, he repeatedly expresses an irresistible attraction to the sea. Despite the suffering it brings, he continues to return to it. The paradox has generated considerable scholarly debate. Some critics interpret the poem primarily as Christian allegory. According to this reading, the sea represents the difficult journey of human life. Earthly existence is understood as a form of exile from God, and the hardships endured by the seafarer symbolizes the spiritual struggles of humanity. The attraction of the sea reflects the soul's desire to transcend worldly comforts and seek eternal truth. From this perspective, the poem describes a pilgrimage towards spiritual fulfillment. This interpretation gains support from the poem's later sections, where the speaker reflects upon the transitory nature of earthly life. Wealth, power, and worldly pleasures are portrayed as temporary and ultimately unsatisfactory. Human achievements vanish with time. Death comes to all, therefore, the true wisdom lies not in pursuing material success but in directing one's attention towards the eternal realities of God. Other scholars, however, argue that the poem should not be interpreted exclusively through a Christian lens. They point out that the themes of exile, suffering, and stoic endurance were already present in Germanic heroic culture before the arrival of Christianity. According to this view, the poem preserves an older tradition in which hardship itself becomes a source of wisdom. The sea presents not spiritual pilgrimage but the testing of character. The seafarer's attraction to danger reflects the heroic impulse to confront adversity rather than avoid it. Regardless of which interpretation one prefers, the poem remains deeply concerned with the problem of transience. Human life is fleeting, earthly achievements disappear, the world itself seems unstable. Against this backdrop, the speaker searches for something permanent. Whether that permanence is understood in heroic or Christian terms, the quest itself lies at the heart of the poem. Closely related to the seafarer is the wanderer, another masterpiece of Anglo-Saxon elegiac poetry. Many scholars regard the two poems as companion pieces because both explore exile, memory, and search for wisdom. Yet the wanderer is even more intensely personal in its emotional focus. The poem presents the voice of an isolated individual who has lost his lord and companions. He wanders alone, separated from the social bonds that once gave meaning to his life. To understand the depth of his suffering, we must remember the central importance of the lord-retainer relationship in Anglo-Saxon society. A warrior's identity depended upon his connection to his lord. The lord provided protection, purpose, and belonging. To lose one's lord was therefore not merely a political misfortune but an existential crisis. The wanderer's grief is intensified by memory again and again. He recalls the warmth of the mead hall, the companionship of fellow warriors, and the security of communal life. These memories stand in painful contrast to his present condition. The past appears vibrant and meaningful, while the present is characterized by isolation and uncertainty. A recurring concept throughout the poem is weird, often translated as fate. In Anglo-Saxon thought, Weird represents the inescapable forces that shape human existence. I'll spell out the word WYRD. It is not a deity but a recognition of the inevitability of change and mortality. The wanderer understands that suffering is part of the human condition. No amount of courage or wisdom can completely shield individuals from the workings of fate. Yet the poem does not end in despair. Gradually, the speaker moves from personal grief towards broader philosophical reflection. His suffering becomes a source of insight. He recognizes that all earthly things are temporary. Wealth disappears, kingdoms collapse, friends die, human achievements fade into ruin. The world itself is marked by impermanence. This realization leads to a form of wisdom described as stoic. The wise person does not become excessively attached to worldly success because he understands its temporary nature. Instead, he cultivates emotional discipline and inner stability in the final section of the poem. This wisdom acquires a distinctively Christian dimension. True security is located not in earthly institutions but in the Heavenly Father. The permanence denied by the world is found in God. Whether this conclusion represents the original intention of the poem or a later Christian reinterpretation remains a matter of scholarly debate. Nevertheless, the synthesis is characteristics of Anglo-Saxon literature as a whole. Heroic and Christian perspectives do not replace one another. Instead, they coexist and interact. Taken together, Deor, the Seafarer, the Wanderer reveal the extraordinary depth of Anglo-Saxon poetry. These works move beyond the celebration of heroic achievement and confront some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. How should one respond to suffering? How should one live in a world marked by uncertainty and loss? Where can permanence be found in a transient world? The answers offered by these poems are neither simple nor uniform, yet they share a common conviction that wisdom emerges through confrontation with adversity. Exile, loss, and suffering are not only merely unfortunate experiences, they become opportunities for reflection and understanding. As we move forward, we will see how the spread of Christianity transformed these concerns and gave rise to a new body of literature. The heroic world did not disappear overnight. Instead, Christian writers adapted its language, imagery, and values to express a different vision of human life. With this note, I end today's lecture. We'll continue with this in the next lectures that follow. Follow and subscribe for more lectures. Thank you.